How are you guys this morning? Good. It looks like a few people have stepped out for a minute, so I will entertain you a little bit on the way to my presentation. I'm going to start a little bit with my background and an introduction, and then I'll tell you about my morning. I was a little bit delayed on the way to the airport, but I think it's relevant for our conversations here, so I'm going to share a story with you. You can say it either way. My name is Kay Lawrence, Catherine Lawrence. If you need to email me, lawrence.catherine@epa.gov. That can sometimes trip people up when you go by too many names. I'm the Chief of Emergency Prevention and Preparedness for EPA Region 9 in San Francisco. And in our portfolio of programs, we have emergency prevention, which is the Clean Air Act 112R program, or the CalARP equivalent, and the OSHA PSM analog. We have the EPCRA 311-312 or non-TRI information, so inventory reporting, which is the business plan analog for California. And then also CERCLA 103, which is accident reporting, which is the analog to also EPCRA 304 and to California's release reporting obligations. So I will be speaking to the federal program. I'll touch on our terrific partnership with the state and also with our OSHA and federal partners. And the CUPAs. As far as my background goes, I've been in this position, I mark it by how old my son is. He's 13, so I've been in this position for 13 years. Prior to that, I was an on-scene coordinator for EPA and did emergency response work. I did that for 10 years. And that helps to inform the other side of my shop, which is the emergency preparedness side and the planning side, where we do emergency planning. You know, you do prevention first. You're not going to prevent them all, so you got to plan for what that subset of consequences is going to happen. And then I have a partner and a colleague, Harry Allen, who does emergency response. So on the planning side, preparedness side, I'll talk a little bit about that because there's some important parts of risk management, certainly important integral parts of EPCRA, and the new regulations that focus on transitioning from the prevention part of the program into the preparedness part, recognizing that we need to also prepare for these potential emergencies when they happen. Prior to my time as an OSC, I was briefly an RPM in the Superfund program, and then I was an inspector for 5 years, never in the prevention world, but I did both RCRA and NPDES and other Clean Water Act industrial permit inspections in Kansas, out of the Kansas City office, and then I moved to San Francisco. So I had a good experience. I got here this morning, and I had an interesting experience that really speaks to me about process safety and why it's so important that it be structured. I was flying from Oakland to Burbank, sunny sky, beautiful morning, took off early, was going to get in early, thought I'd be here with you guys to share coffee, donuts, water, and probably just a couple hundred feet over the runway, aborted landing. And I mean, he took off as fast as he could, straight up in the air. We were getting not quite towards touchdown, but straight up in the air. It took a while for him to tell us what was going on. So, you know, nobody was over surprised. There wasn't any screaming or anything, but it was a very energetic takeoff. And when he finally came on to tell us that we were being diverted to Ontario, he explained that the fog, combination of the fog and the sunlight and the glare, my assumption was he could not see the runway. He was outside of his safe operating window that he had defined ahead of time, that was probably led to by a series of good, recognized safe engineering practices, by where process safety management started, which, you know, in many respects was probably with the aviation industry, and the need to get to checklist-driven systems, need to understand safe operating windows, because the consequences of deviation were significant, and there were mortal consequences. Now, did other planes land right after us? I would guess that they did. Could he have landed? He probably thought, you know, 80%, 90%, I'll get this. But it was outside of his safe operating windows, and he went to his checklist, said, you can't see the runway, you need to abort the landing. And he did. And that consequence was additional cost for his company. That consequence was delayed time for me to get to my meeting and all the other passengers, et cetera. But I appreciate the decision that he made. Because I think, you know, I wasn't in his chairs, but he made a plan, he valued the plan, and he stuck to the plan, and that's important, and did not intervene with what I imagine would have probably been going through anybody said in that situation. Well, I think I can make it. I think, you know, probably going to get this. Stuck to the plan. And that's part of what the principles of process safety management, the very important principles of process safety management are, is identify process safety information, get process hazard analysis, make a plan, and stick to the plan, because I think we all know that with almost every accident, yeah, stuff bad is going to happen, but with almost every accident, if you follow it back upstream, it's deviation from the plan. It's normalizing that deviation. And then eventually not, would he have gotten that landing the first time? Yeah. Second time, third time? Absolutely could have happened. Fourth time? Steve might have gotten a different message from me. On my way to the hospital, whatever. And that's I think it's a good example, and I think it's a very telling example, and one that I'm hesitant to share, but I think is also important. Is I think we all experience that just driving. Honestly, the glare on the windshield, you can't really see the road. What should you do in that situation? Consider a different route, slow down, lots of different things. There was a very unfortunate accident about 3 years ago where a father in our community lost his life because glare on the window, somebody couldn't see the road, couldn't see the pedestrian. And that ended up in a tragic consequence. There was no, SOP for that, but I think that was certainly in my mind when I'm ever in that situation, I have glare on the road, I'm slowing way down, I'm taking a different route, I'm going to work around what is identified as a hazard. And we can all learn, obviously, that's one of the reasons why people are in this room, from other people's mistakes, to not make them, to identify those mistakes ahead of time, and to put what seems like a little extra time, a little extra effort, a little extra money into safety, because you can't put a price on it. If an accident happens, one of your employees doesn't go home, one of you doesn't go home, etc. So that was a really good personal experience, and I'll use that again in the future potentially. But I also need to stay on time, and I know I'm between you guys and a much well-earned break. So Steve, I have a half an hour. Is that correct? What time are you guys due for your break? Okay. Well, so I just finished a presentation last week at the RITA conference there, and it's about the size of this audience, and I talked to these guys for about an hour 20, and they asked me to do another presentation. So there's so much, and I know I've seen you present, so I'm looking forward to seeing your presentation, and I'll probably ask the same thing because there's a lot of opportunity for learning. I will not do an hour and a half. This is a different one. Okay, I'm going to keep to my script here. I am not going to talk about what I talked about there, which is the Executive Order 13650, which you may have touched on briefly. That is the collaboration that the federal government is working with right now on. Very good. Cool. Yeah. Oh, I'll do that at the end if I have time. What I do want to focus on is what you asked me to talk about, which is EPA Region 9's Clean Air Act 112R program. So I'm going to focus on, I'm not going to talk that much about EPCRA because that's a whole different arena of facilities and approaches. And I'll talk more specifically about what we look for when we do inspections. And then I will talk at the end about a little bit on the rulemaking and maybe some of the executive order, and then we can expand the conversation from there. Does that work for you, Steve? Okay, cool. So to stay relevant, one of the things I'd like to do is to understand who the audience is, so that I can tailor some of my remarks to the audience. So I think I know generally, because I see Fariba at the front, that there's definitely people who are process safety management professionals on the regulator side. How many folks in the room come from that walk? Okay, terrific. How many process safety management professionals on the consulting side? All right, industry? Mostly industry. Operators, I mean, as a subset of industry, how many people are actually in the plants working on some of this equipment? Okay, good. And I don't think and anybody else who just thought this looked like a good time. It is a good time. This is great. This is important stuff, and it translates to other walks of life. So that's great, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is what EPA looks at when we're in your facilities, what our universe looks like, and an opportunity for some Q&A. So accident prevention, inspection, and enforcement processes. One other thing I do want to ask: how many of on the business side, how many people came here primarily because anhydrous ammonia is their main process safety chemical? Okay, so that's good. And then I think I heard some questions about chlorine. I am, at Steve's request, going to focus some of the compliance conversation on anhydrous ammonia for a couple of reasons, which I'll get into as I go through my presentation in the next 20 minutes. And I assume everybody can hear me. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to go over a summary of Region 9's risk management program, our footprint, et cetera. I do want to cover the general duty clause very briefly, the nature and general pattern of EPA Region 9 inspections for 112R, common deficiencies noted during inspections, primarily at anhydrous ammonia facilities, and I will do some attribution up front, because I hope I don't steal any of Mr. Doring's slides, because I have picked up some great tips, obviously, from other regulated partners. So if you see a set of bullets that look like you authored them, raise your hand and I'll give more specific attribution, because over time it's both from our team when they have commonly identified things, but what we learn from other people when they look at anhydrous ammonia facilities. I'm not going to focus too much on recent R9 enforcement activity. I might touch on one or two cases, but in the interest of time, I'd like to talk a little bit more about our upcoming EPA National Enforcement Initiative, and that'll sort of lead into some conversation about our proposed reg and what we see in the future for our program. And then hopefully the 5 minutes for questions that Steve asked me to leave. Okay. So what does our universe look like? Now Region 9's footprint is California, Arizona, Nevada, Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands. As you can tell from the slide, the majority of our customers, our work is in California by far. And I will speak primarily to California program findings. And these are our RMPs by CUPA. Now, as many of you may know, and I'll touch on a little bit later, the threshold for your access to the RMP club under Clean Air Act 112R7 and the obligation to submit an RMP to EPA for anhydrous ammonia is 10,000 pounds. And obviously for CalARP, it's significantly less. It's 500 pounds. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means for us. But we're looking at systems, processes that are charged with 10,000 pounds or more. Do you not have to have process safety management if you have less than that? No. And we'll talk a little bit about that with respect to the general duty clause. Because again, I also think, if I hadn't said it earlier, process safety management and risk management, it is the regulatory framework, but it was preceded by good business, good engineering practices, and that's really what largely defines it. It's an important way to manage a safe business. A safe business is one that can be a business, make the revenues that are required, stay in business for a long time, not hurt employees, not hurt the business's reputation, not hurt folks around there. So I think that's important to know, that this is not just a regulation like, for example, NPDES might be or RCRA might be. It really is a very important business principle. So this is how our RMPs are distributed through the state. We should have our offices down in Los Angeles if we were really following the data. There are a lot in the Bay Area, but truly this is a concentration of opportunity here in LA, and that's why we value our partnership with Anna and also with FREBA and other risk management professionals down here. We don't get down here nearly enough. California states by industry, and this is an important thing I think for us to point out as well. And if folks want to take a look at these statistics, EPA does have an online database, part of which is visible. This is part of the visible part in terms of being able, it's a CDX, so epa.cdx.gov I think is how you'll be able to get to it. If that's wrong, I'll correct myself at the end of the day. But that is the delivery window for RMPs. It also has some good data. So what does the data tell us? Food and beverage, 28% of the California universe for RMP. Agriculture, 24%. Combined, it's approaching 60% of our universe has some relationship to anhydrous ammonia. When you look at water and wastewater, 18%. What's that likely going to be? Chlorine, SO2, primarily driven by chlorine. Energy is flammables. Chemical manufacturing is only 10%. Those are the more exotic risks that we might look at. So we look at the data, and we look at California. We're in California a lot, and we also are very focused on anhydrous ammonia, partly because of this, But also, when you look down, here's a ranking of chemicals by quantity, which is kind of interesting. Flammable mixtures, butane is next. Propane's pretty significant. Anhydrous ammonia, again, at the top. 98,000, almost 100,000 tons in quantity. 500 active facilities, 604 processes. Chlorine, 20,000 tons, and then probably about not quite a third of the number of processes. So we follow the data, and other parts of the data we follow besides the volume. I'm going to jump ahead real quickly and then come back to this other thing, because I think it's important to look at these things first. Here are some of the threshold quantities. PSM's 10,000, RMP's 10,000, CalARP 50. And you can see, 500, my bad, yeah. And for general duty clause, it's any. We'll talk a little bit about that. Here's other places where we take the data. We follow the data to where you can have your most meaningful impact in the program. Blue is ammonia, anhydrous ammonia. We're looking at accident history by chemical from 1999 to 2014. And you can see that well above the trend line is anhydrous ammonia, or the standardized line, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not a data scientist, though. I understand they get paid very well these days. And then chlorine next. Is that because this industry disproportionately represents accidents? Or is it because there's more facilities out there? We've not done an analysis on the percentages that you would just actually go if you looked at the population, what that would derive. I would argue that a lot of it has to do with the fact that anhydrous ammonia is so ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and that can drive the numbers. That also drives the opportunity for good process safety management practices, because there's a lot of data to learn from. That's also the case for chlorine. Here's the trends as well, more specifically for RMP reportable accidents. And then specifically for California, again, we look at anhydrous ammonia and leading the charge on that. So what does that bring us to? It brings us to a lot of activity around anhydrous ammonia. And I think also when we talk about what we're doing with the executive order, just teeing off of that, both nationally, I'll talk about this, the NEI, but also regionally, we are focusing a lot of our conversations around anhydrous ammonia because we think we can get a lot of traction on that particular facility. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here, is there's a good opportunity to do partnership and outreach, but also to bring up the inspector credentials and doing extra training around that, having additional conversations with process safety management and training professionals. I'm not going to get into the details about that, but if you're interested in learning more, I'm happy to talk about it a little bit later, or maybe jump on one of Steve's other presentations to talk more specifically about our executive order. And yet, not to clobber all the ammonia folks a little bit more, this slide. Now, I have a few slides from the Ammonia Safety and Training Institute, and they did a deeper dive on the analysis of accident trends. Jumping through again. No. Now I'll go back to the general duty. I will go to our inspections. I'll do that, and then I'm going to circle back around to general duty clause because I think that's going to flow a little bit better. So our inspection approach, we've been through a really terrific hiring level of hiring activity, but we still only have, for as big a map as I showed you, 5.5 credentialed inspectors, soon to be 6 inspectors on the team that I manage, and nearly 1,100 facilities. So we have to be smart about where we go. And how do we figure out where we go? Well, first of all, we define our universe about how many inspections can we actually lift. And this past year and the year before that, our target is generally around 33. In the past, we've done as many as 72, but what we're trying to do is more in-depth, more technically focused inspections. That takes a little more time, but we think it's going to be more meaningful and then be more broadly impactful with industry. We also have a good partnership and growing partnership with the CUPAs, so we can select our targets is a harsh term, but our opportunities, I think, in partnership with them. And going to that, we focus on what we call high-risk facilities. That's an algorithm that our headquarters folks looked at. It's not the only thing that we do because it's not necessarily the place where the most accidents happen, but it is the place where, by our data, it suggests that the most impactful accidents could happen. So one of the things, as many of you know, you are obligated to do if you submit an RMP to EPA, is that you need to do an off-site consequence analysis You need to understand not only the risks internally to your organization, to your employees, but you also need to understand the impact that you might have on the surrounding community. And for EPA, you need to do an off-site consequence analysis. We take that data, and that factors into our high risk. If there's a footprint of a certain size, that gets factored into what we call our high risk universe. We also do an analysis of basically the risk of the hazard index risk of what you have on site, which is both the nature of the chemical and also the quantity of the chemical. Worked with the Wharton School of Business from the University of Pennsylvania, and they came up with this algorithm that basically produced a standardized number that hopefully captures risk. Again, it's just a comparative risk number, and we use that to also in our universe of identifying high risk facilities. If you fall above 25, you're identified as a potential high risk facility. High consequence is probably a much better name for that, because again, risk is a function of potential for accident, but the consequence is significant. The other element that we factor into that is if a facility has had an accident in the last 5 years. Now that truly is telling of risk, generally, because something went wrong that produced an accident that was subsequently reportable. At least a good percentage of those probably were preventable, and so that puts folks on our radar screen. So that's how we target at the front. When we really look at our full population, of approximately 15% fall into that high risk category tier. The other place that we identify facilities is through release reporting and other RMP reportable accidents. And one of our obligations for the national program, which is standardized and increasingly standardized, is that if a facility has had an RMP reportable accident, we will plan to visit them within the next 6 months. That's one of our goals, because we want to get out there. Yes? It's not, you're talking about the hazard index? So the hazard index is actually, you know, it's more of it's a surrogate analysis. It's basically looking at a way to sort the data in a way that we can basically get priorities. So it's not assigning a specific number to a facility, though that it does produce that result. And I should know this. I'm most certain that Wharton business algorithm is releasable. So if people wanted a copy of it to understand that, I certainly could share that with folks. Yes. So that is a good point, and is actually something I will talk about when we talk about the new regulations. Because we need to change that, because it needs to, one, probably capture a little bit more. Right now, it's a release that causes off-site consequences and impact. And I should read it very specifically to you guys, but it raises some questions. People aren't really sure where they stand. Some people over-report. It's important to see those trend numbers. You know, at the beginning of the program, you see a lot of accidents. That's also reflective of a bias maybe towards over-reporting. So the data is, I think, good just for some general trends analysis, and it's important for us to understand it, but we want it to get tighter so that we're really tracking something that's very definable. I think that's also the case for when you look at off-site consequence analysis. You know, there's a lot of debate about that, and some people find that a troubling number in terms of really, is it really the worst case scenario? It is an algorithm that produces a result that provides a comparative basis of risk and allows a way to have a standardized platform for planning, which is the important part of it, is understanding that and then leaning your EAP into planning for that kind of consequence. Could there be other definitions of what worst case? Absolutely, but we needed to standardize it. That was the approach that was taken, and the way to be able to bridge that gap is the alternative worst case scenario, which may define more realistic scenarios. And there certainly are people on the other side of the off-site consequence analysis spectrum who argue that it doesn't go far enough because it doesn't talk about domino effects, especially when you come to flammables. You're not going to necessarily have one tank involved in a fire. You're going to have potentially multiple tanks involved in a fire, depending on the circumstances. So worst case scenario it's meant to capture, again, a metric that provides a comparative base and also provides a standard for whether you get into other elements of the program. The Wharton school number is just something that EPA needed to do to help us get our arms around a really big data set and make some smart decisions about how we were going to deploy our resources and where it made sense for us to focus, and was produced to a certain extent after a series of IG evaluations of the program suggesting that EPA had not done that yet and we needed to come up with a good way to do it. I say that it is a guidance document, and certainly in the program I manage, we deviate from that to go where we see actual risk, which brings me to the next most important, I think, metric for targeting inspections, which is our partnership with first responders, our partnerships with the CUPAs, our partnerships with the states, people who have been in these facilities, partnerships with people who may be in facilities and really uncomfortable working there. That doesn't happen that often, but tips that we get where there's an issue, news reports where there's a release, industry trends, also an important place, not mentioned here. There's an accident, for example, around in the petroleum refining industry around HTA, high temperature hydrogen attack, or sulfidation corrosion. We look at what are, granted they're not leading indicators anymore because unfortunately an accident has actually happened, but something that's being looked at broadly. Or for example, there was a solenoid concern in the anhydrous ammonia industry a while. We factored that in at least to our inspections, and a number of other things. So that'll help us also figure out targeting and also help us tailor our inspections. Okay, so how do our inspections typically go? I'm going to speed talk right now if I haven't already been doing it. 1 day on site for most of our inspections. Generally, you're going to be given advance notice. We are not subject, like OSHA is, to an obligation to show up unannounced, though we will occasionally show up unannounced. But in our experience, when we did that before, it did not make the conversation that productive. You either, in many circumstances, have a good, well-developed, well-presented process safety management, risk management program, or you don't. You can't get a week's notice and make it up. Or maybe you can, and it's good. I mean, that's partly, you get to a little closer to compliance, we'll still see that you were out of compliance. But if you get a notice, absolutely, it's a good chance to do a self-audit. We do want to see what you were doing before the self-audit, but our overall goal, like anybody's goal, is meaningful compliance, safe facilities. So we do give advance notice, and that helps us get the documents in advance, because it is a very paper-driven inspection part, even though the most important part of what we do is looking around the facility. We do a team approach. We usually have a couple of people come because there is so much, just like you have in your facilities often. A couple of people doing your PHAs, certainly. People compiling the PSIs. It's not just a single person. It shouldn't be. It takes a lot of disciplines, and it takes a lot of eyes and different eyes to really get the right result. And then we always invite the CUPAs or the PAs for the collaborative opportunity. And in California, the CUPAs are there much more frequently than we are, so that's really important. The inspection process, facility identification, tentative scheduling, facility notification, we already talked about that, and then we conduct the inspection. What do we do? Everyone's been subject to inspections here, I'm sure. For some programs, it's a pretty standard approach. Do the credential to start the inspections, and then meet with the employee representatives is also an important part of our program. Facility process walkthrough, interview, doc review, closeout meetings. What will happen different than some other meeting or inspections, at least in programs I was involved in, is there's going to be a conversation afterwards. It's very likely we'll ask for copies of documents afterwards, documents either that we didn't have an opportunity to look at, you didn't have on site, which is an issue for us, because if we've given you advance notice, it's difficult for us, and it does at least leave an impression if, even though we've asked for documents, you cannot present them, or you can't present the people who are responsible for that. If there's a scheduling conflict, that's fine. If you can't find the documents, that's a little bit telling about your program. So we still do ask for some follow-up, and then we follow up with the compliance conversation if we find problems. So what are some commonly observed deficiencies that we see? I'm sure you've seen some of these before. And there's super easy ones to fix for the most part. Failure to report accidents within 6 months, especially those involving greater or less than RQ amounts. So what does that mean? That means your obligation for an RMP reportable accident is not the RQ. It is a consequence. Your accident is a release and a consequence. Separately, you have an obligation to report if you release above a reportable quantity. And I do want to leave people with an understanding. It's your first reasonable expectation that you've had a reportable quantity. It's not after your engineers get out their slide rule and figure out what that safety relief valve was leaking, and you come to a conclusion that, you know what, it was actually 1,000 pounds, and then you report it even though that RQ was significantly lower. It's better to bias that when you know that there's a significant, especially if there's going to be offsite consequences. The main purpose is obviously to get the first responders out there, but it's also to get the notification into the system, because we also have first responders and we often offer help. Failure to change the emergency response POC within 6 months. I see this as particularly troubling because that's part of the purpose of this program. Define your risk, plan for your risk. That is very importantly involves who your risk professionals are on the inside and the outside of the fence, and suggest that you may have a paper program and you're not paying attention to detail if when you have such a fundamental change in your program, you don't actually update your plan. Failure to resolve, document, and track PHA audit and accident investigation findings. This is low-hanging fruit, folks. You've made and I'm talking to industry here, but maybe also to our partners. It's something that I think all folks on the regulatory side, and certainly on the side of the consultants, will look at. You spend so much time and money and effort doing a PHA, doing an audit, doing an investigation. You identify problems that need to be followed up on. It's really important to track those. It's important for the executives in the organization, the people who manage the budget, to own part of that so that they understand what their obligations are to invest in good process safety. Failure to develop SOPs for all operations, especially temporary operations. Where's some of the greatest risk? When you deviate from the standard and you have to develop, even if it's an MOC and you develop an SOP separate for that deviation, that has people thinking about it. And it does take time, and it does take maybe a little extra money. But again, you want everybody to go home at the end of the day, and you don't want to hurt your neighbors, and you don't want to damage your business, because that's also what can happen. Failure to certify SOPs annually. Again, you've made the time and investment. It's a great training opportunity. You have to train your employees anyway, so you need to train them on the SOPs. Annualizing that seems like a pretty straightforward thing and is very important, because one of the things it allows you to do is to bring home the importance part of SOPs are there for a reason. If we want to change the SOPs because they don't make sense and it's not really the way we do stuff, there's a better way to do it, change the SOP. But don't have an SOP that says we're going to, have this elaborate Thanksgiving dinner when really you're just going to have is a turkey sandwich. You define the turkey sandwich if it's safe and your PSI and your PHA lead you to that result, because that'll be meaningful to the people who are actually sitting down at the table and doing the work. And then you don't end up in that gotcha. And you also have less of a chance of having elaborate SOPs that nobody follows anyways, of people continuing to MacGyver it, depart from the norm, go down that path that is so well tread for what happens when accidents happen, which is people had good practices. My pilot made the plan. My pilot had safe operating windows. He needed to get to the Starbucks in Burbank, and he's going to make that plane land. He deviated from his plan. That may not be the best example, but I think it's a valuable one for me. Okay, and I'm coming up on 10, so I am going to take your offer for a little bit of deviation from time and move through these quickly. Other things, incomplete PSI information. This gets to part of the ragged gap issue. Get your PSI together. Can you create good engineering practices based on process safety information that's very specific to what your facility does? Yes. Failure to ensure everyone gets refresher training. Failure to document it. Failure to develop and implement written maintenance procedures, etc. You can see all these, so I don't need to read all of them, but I will read at least one more important one, which is a management of change. That's another way to get past the SOP issue. If the SOP doesn't make sense, the temporary operating conditions where you need an SOP is you can also use an MOC, management of change. Just make sure it's a thoughtful process. It's important just to think a little bit about it, have the right people thinking about it, and everybody agrees to the plan and then moves forward. And we often see MOCs on an after the fact. Or see an MOC that people identified that things needed to be changed, and they're like, okay, we're done with the MOC. They don't make the changes, and they still move ahead with what they plan to do, not taking advantage of the information in the MOC. Okay, for anhydrous ammonia refrigeration, more specifically, mechanical integrity deficiencies related to PRV, inadequate ventilation, inadequate component labeling, very simple one. That one's one you can fix before you know we're coming on site. And then you have component labeling. I would advise you have it up front. It's important to your facilities. It's important to your responders to understand these things, and it's important to make sure it's very visible. And deficient SOPs. Also, when we look at inadequate ventilation release system design bases, we've taken a number of cases because we have vents that are not at 15 feet or are directed in the wrong place. There have been accidents where you'll have maybe 15 feet, but then the vent will be redirected to the HVAC system, and then you have a release, it gets sucked back in, and it goes into the processing area, and you end up with a consequence that should have been identified ahead of time. So make sure that when you put these safety systems in place, they are designed in a way that takes the whole run of safety. And when you look at ragged gap, you look at IIAR standards, one of the benefits of those is you can figure out all that engineering yourself and hire contractors to figure out that, to personalize it. But there are great consensus standards that have already done all that hard work. That's a good place to go, I would advise, and is a reasonable place to go as far as where EPA looks for good process safety information. Okay, these I'm going to go through very quickly. This is really the only slide. I know, Steve, you asked me to talk a little bit about IIAR. I'll talk about it just very broadly. In looking at ragged gap and consensus standards, as many of you may know, OSHA last summer, EPA already has ragged gap that the recognized and generally accepted good engineering principles, practices. I do that. Thank you. I'll put a few nuggets out there where people can correct me. I think that helps with the learning process. That there was a memo that helped, I think, put some more to solidify that definition a little bit more. I know it's under debate right now, but it still is in place. OSHA has some great resources that EPA goes to. Independent of that discussion with the OSHA ragged gap memo, we have always looked at IIAR bulletins, the IIAR guidelines, the ASHRAE, ASTM standards, API codes and standards, depending on what we're looking at, as a really good go-to place for ragged gap manufacturing. There is an opportunity for you to look at your process specifically and develop good engineering practices, but they can't just dismiss what are recognized and accepted industry consensus standards and go a completely different direction. That's not a good practice, and it really doesn't I think show a good, true showing of adequate process safety management. So we do look at those, and I'm just going to go through these and let you review them yourself. So, and I will give attribution for these. I borrowed these without license from Clyde Trombettis' presentation with CalOSHA. They've got some good materials and I think some good pictures. We look at the same things they do. I did pull out some of the things that are more related to electrical concerns because that's not really something EPA looks at, or trip fall hazard, even though we might notice it, it's not really covered in our regs. Here's one I did leave in, moving parts guarded. That again is more of a process safety management OSHA standard than it would be for EPA. Okay. King valve, that is, I think, an important thing. It should be readily accessible and identified with a prominent sign. The other thing to factor into this, as well as I think other things, and we've seen accidents happen from this, and I believe, Mike, are you going to talk at all about the? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to leave that. He's got a really great presentation on an accident that happened that takes into human factors account into how you really want to approach good design, meaningful design, easily accessible design to make sure that you have a good safety result in the end. 15 feet, and then also greater than 20 feet away from windows, ventilation intakes, or building exits. As I mentioned before, you don't want it to go, your relief vent to go up and then end up with a consequence getting sucked back into the building. Or as we took a case out in Nevada, and this was actually an anhydrous ammonia. It wasn't a refrigeration system, it was an air treatment system. there was a release of the anhydrous ammonia, and it vented up, and then the exit that all the employees came out of, that is exactly where the relief pipe came out and vented right into the exit pathway for the emergency. And that's why people went to the hospital. It wasn't because they were exposed inside the building. They were exposed on their way out of the building on the evacuation. And it wasn't 15 feet, and it was pointed in the wrong direction. Here's some more interesting trends for RMP, ammonia refrigeration piping. This is a general other release source process, etc. So it's interesting when we take that into consideration in our training on what maybe we should look at. And then the reason for ammonia refrigeration releases. Equipment failure. Human error is second, and one would suggest that human error potentially contributed to equipment failure because of deviation from SOPs, not following manufacturer instructions, letting a piece of equipment operate too long or incorrectly, and then of course it fails. But if you back that up even further, it wasn't because somebody just cranked it the wrong way, it's because it should have been replaced or designed differently. Okay, US EPA enforcement options, we have several. Obviously, our on-site time with the industry is very important, and in exchange of our first impressions on what we have identified at that time, so that people can get working on what is the most important thing, which is meaningful compliance in areas that can affect process safety. It's really scary to leave a facility. If you see things, you think it's going to be an accident waiting to happen, and it takes too long to develop the conversation. So we try to start immediately. And then we have a growing practice of sending out a notice of findings, which I wouldn't necessarily call as an enforcement action, but it's basically a request for information saying, this is what we found. What do you think about it? What are you doing about it? And it gives the facility an opportunity to say, oh, you got that wrong. This is actually what we're doing. Or 2, you're right, and this is how we fixed it. Or the in-between, which is we don't agree with you. We don't think that you evaluated this correctly. And then we understand more specifically over time where you're at, and that helps us decide how we're going to move our enforcement case forward, which could be an administrative order saying you need to fix this now. Ideally, that's on consent, so it's a collaborative conversation. Then we get more broadly to meaningful compliance. But we do issue unilateral orders, and that is an increasing practice across the country in terms of when we find problems that are significant. And OSHA is very good at this, and I think a lot of the CUPAs are good at that, is being very directive about the problems that they see soon after they see them to get them fixed right away. And then ultimately, administrative penalties. I will give you guys a heads up. I don't have the specifics right now. You may be aware that there's a change to overall federal penalty rates because of very delayed inflation adjustments. So the EPA penalties, actually all penalties, are likely going to be going up within the coming year. And we expect maybe as early as August 1st. Because we have standardized penalties of $37,005 for some statutes, $28,500 for other statutes, and they haven't been changed in 2 decades, 3 decades, and you know that housing's a lot more expensive and food is. So the penalties, as they were made based on economic decisions at the time, are also going to go up. Civil judicial referrals, where we get DOJ involved, and then also criminal penalties. There are criminal provisions to our statutes. So if you are willful, don't be willful. Do the right thing. It's a criminal violation to knowingly depart from Clean Air Act 112R. Knowingly not submit your risk management plan when you know your facility is obligated to do that. Would not put yourself in that position. It doesn't make sense to do it. These are reasonable programs. And we're trying to get very good technical analysis to get reasonable enforcement outcomes too. We do have expedited settlement agreements if we see things that are relatively minor and easy to fix. Those are very straightforward. The cap is $15,000. If you get into the other part of our enforcement world, the penalties are potentially substantial to reflect the nature of the noncompliance and the need to balance the ship. There are plenty of facilities that stay in compliance, put the investment in, and then for the outliers, if the way that they're going to do their math is, you know what, I'll pay instead of investing up front, I'll deal with it on the backside. There needs to be both a deterrent effect in the penalties and a recognition that this is important. It's meant to speak primarily to that facility that has departed from what they should do, but more broadly to the industry to both be a little bit of a shout out to the people who are making the investment to say, you know what, this guy is still suffering a business consequence. It's not just that you're making all the investment and not getting any return, to balance that, as well as to I think is a good, I get a ticket going down the road too fast, so I won't do it next time. Okay, and finally, and I'm so sorry to go 15 minutes over, but I do want to talk to you a bit about the California, the 112R National Enforcement Initiative, which is coming off of EO 13650, which was preceded by the terrible accident in West Texas, which killed 15 first responders. Many of you may have seen in the news yesterday that ATF has identified that as arson, unfortunately. There were probably still some process safety management things that could have been in place at this facility that would have not led to the ultimate explosion and consequence, and certainly some practices for the first responders of awareness and training that might have led to being at a distance while that fire burned. But it is terrible that it was arson, and is something that the EO also looks at as intentional acts. But that led to also a little bit of our initial focus on anhydrous ammonia and fertilizers, and looking at the 5 sectors that we'll primarily but not exclusively look at in the National Enforcement Initiative, which is basically a collaborative alignment of all of the EPA regions in looking at process safety management, risk management in these sectors predominantly: ammonia refrigeration, fertilizer distribution, refineries, chemical manufacturing, and gas processing. You remember the pie chart I showed you before. That's where most of the action is. That's where most of the accidents are. And part of the initiative is a focused conversation. We're also doing a tremendous amount of training for our inspectors. When we go into these facilities, we need to be technically credible. We're not operators, but we're taking operator training so that people are looking at things in a meaningful way. And certainly on the industry side, we can have a good conversation with you. We're sponsoring training in collaboration with OSHA as well as the CUPAs to do the same, so that we can get better at identifying the things. And this is already public. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to take more bigger enforcement cases. It does take, we're going to be more collaborative on them, and we're going to be focused at a high management level on this relatively small program. And the goal is to improve corporate and sector-wide safety and compliance. And we're looking at, other than, while it's called the National Enforcement Initiative, it's meant to be influenced by SMART. Are there other things we can do in collaboratives, in working with consensus standards groups, in working with folks like RITA, et cetera, to help support the good safety practices that are already industry-based, that are adopted, to do that? It doesn't just have to be an enforcement conversation. It should be, we're all on this together to try to get the right outcome. Safe communities, safe workers, et cetera. Now, I've really blown past my time, so I'm not going to get too much in the weeds on the EPA new proposals. Steve covered them to a certain extent, but I'd be happy to entertain questions if you have any. Did you go through each of the items that we're proposing? The 4 key ones? Okay, that's good.
And I would encourage you guys, this is a great opportunity to get right from the beginning. If you have questions on some of the items that are
And the deadline for comments is tomorrow. I will call Jim Belkey and let you know at break. My guess is yes. That's kind of how it works if you're applying for a job for EPA. Don't go by, if you're 10 o'clock on the Pacific time frame. Yeah, it's usually East Coast time. It's not Greenwich Mean Time, so we're not going to make it that complicated. And it is very, very important because we do want to get this right. And if you were involved in it up front, this is a much smaller subset from our initial RFI, request for information. We were asking for input. And for those who are following, similarly, OSHA's efforts for process safety management changes to their regulations, they have their RFI out. It is much broader. My expectation is, though this is not a policy statement at all, so this is just Kay talking, is much like California. EPA is moving ahead because we have some significant concerns about the emergency response conversation. That's one of the main driving forces for this. This regulation is focused on that. It's focused on making sure that accidents don't happen multiple times, and that once an accident does happen, there's very rigid follow-up to make sure that it's understood, and that's why the third-party audits, and we'll have a lot of conversation on that. There are many solutions. There's probably no perfect solution. We're not going to get a perfection, but we need to advance process safety. And sometimes the third-party eyes are good at helping to do that. And the investment in that is also helpful to do that. But the conversation with the emergency responders is really what we're very much focused on. So we'll go first. OSHA's process is much more it's more structured just because of the nature of the organization and their obligations to Congress and other principles. They're looking at a broader view. I expect that they're definitely going to be looking at different things that EPA did, and then ideally there'll be an opportunity to harmonize the rules on the other side, because you don't want two different sets of standards. They may be different, but they at least need to be harmonized. You guys have any questions? You want your break? No doubt. Thank you for your patience, and thanks for your attention. And if you do have any more questions about the new regs coming up or the EO, I'm happy to entertain them at any time today.